G'day, Trooper Cody and Steve, and I have to say, if there's one thing I love, it's when I get a request from a subscriber. Fair income, some subscribers have come up with the best videos that I hadn't thought of, and so this one is about how did the troopers in World War I wash themselves. Well, that's a great question because basically they didn't, but let's get into it, because the biggest problem for the troops in the First World War were lice. I don't know how old you are, if you've had children, but I tell you there is nothing worse than coming home from a hard day at work and getting a letter from the school saying one of the kids in the class had head lice, and your kids have probably got head lice, and their clothes have got lice, and their bedding has got lice, and their pillow slips have got lice, and they've probably given it to you. You may well have been through this, you may well have been through it more than once, but can you imagine what it was like for those troops who had very little facility to change their clothes or to bathe, and lice thrive in warm environments. They thrive in warm, less than clean environments, and so it was a plague in the First World War, in the trenches, in the Middle East. It was a little bit relieved in the winter in the trenches because of the cold, but then it was trench foot. So we'll get to that. But anyway, so how did the blokes cope with this? What could they do? They were infested with lice. It caused incredible itchiness, scratching. The lice are a tiny parasite, about the size of perhaps two pinheads side by side. They live on blood, love human blood, and they are very clever in that they hide in cracks and crevices, so they love the seams of clothing. They're very hard to kill because they are so hard, and so the best way to kill them when you don't have chemicals or cleanliness was to crush them between your fingernail, and that became called chatting. They gave that the name chatting. They actually had chatting parades. And if you go on the internet and look at photographs, you can see the blokes all lined up, sometimes sitting down, sometimes standing up. They're in line, they're half undressed. They have their shirts in their coat, tunics in their hands. And that's because they're on a chatting parade where they're physically trying to kill the body lice in the seams of their clothing. The guys all smoked heavily, lots of reasons for this, one of which is to try and disguise the stench of the decaying bodies everywhere. Western Front, Middle East, so they smoked. But at least by smoking they had cigarettes and candles that they would then run along the seam of their clothing, not at a speed that burnt the clothing, but at a speed that you would hear the candle go along going pop, 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 as the insect was destroyed by exploding. They know for sure that lice actually gave people what was called trench flu. That was one of the words for it, trench flu. And basically it was a disease reasonably mild, passed on by lice. That was they called it trench flu because the symptoms were similar to the ordinary flu. When I said before about the fact that there was no bathing facilities, you can look at photographs of the Western Front where it was more stagnant, and you will see pictures of enormous water tanks that were heated so that the guys could have baths when they were pulled back from the front line. They were communal baths. There's an old saying about don't throw the baby out with the bath water, and the urban myth is that Dad got in the bath first and the water got dirtier and dirtier as everyone got into the bath. By the time the youngest one in the family got in the bath, bathwater was so dirty you had to make sure you didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Well, that's a bit of an urban myth, but the reality is you wouldn't have wanted to get into a communal Western Front bath after half a dozen other blokes had been in that bath before. It would have been pretty grim. They also had some laundry facilities, rudimentary laundry facilities on the Western Front, so the guys could at least attempt to clean their clothing. But that's the Western Front, stagnant. Two other places we can talk about. The Middle East in general. There was no water. There was hardly enough water for the men to drink. If the men had had enough they could survive, then the horses got a drink. The horses often went days without water. So you tell me, how many times you reckon they had a Hollywood bath laying back in some beautiful tub soaping themselves up? Never happened. The only time they got to bathe in the Middle East was when they were lucky enough to be posted to one of the camps, one of the relief camps, rest camps, R&R camps, that was situated on the beach. And then the guys, can you imagine what that was like? Weeks and weeks, filthy, hot, stinking hot, sweaty, reeking, and then getting a chance to strip off and go into the Mediterranean and get yourself clean. No wonder the guys were naked and rode their horses into the water, because the horses would have loved it too. Apart from that, they never got a chance to wash. The worst thing about all of this is, then there's Gallipoli. If the blokes in the Middle East had it bad, the blokes at Gallipoli, there are no words for what Gallipoli was like, except, let's just say, Ian Idris, who went there for a very short time, because the first time he went he was wounded and taken straight off, and the second time he went he was wounded and got taken straight off. But Ian summed up Gallipoli by saying, of all the bastards of places, this is the greatest bastard in the world. And that was because Gallipoli was virtually a cliff face in which the guys clung on to that cliff face constantly under fire. They had to dig little hollows, caves, to be able to take cover. They were never did the shelling, shooting and machine gun fire stop. Constant noise, constant artillery. It was noise, noise, noise. Dead bodies everywhere, rotting flesh everywhere, and no water. No spring water, no natural water. The only water was the water that was managed to be brought in by ship under shell fire in diabolical cans that often reeked of chemicals that they used to try and keep the water pure, that made it taste vile. Most of the blokes resorted to only drinking in very, very strong black tea to try and cover up the vile taste of the water. What this meant, again, there was no bathing, there was no washing clothes. The thing they say about Gallipoli is dysentery was rife, and yet there were no decent latrines, and the guys who had dysentery, all of the blokes there, couldn't even wash their hands. So when this kind subscriber asked me about this question about how did they keep themselves clean, how did they wash, and then at the end tagged on, and what did they do for toilet paper, there wasn't any toilet paper. When the guys were in New Guinea and they had dysentery on the Kokoda Trail, it is renowned for the fact that they cut huge holes in their trousers at the back so they could go to the toilet without even dropping their trousers, let alone have you got the Kleenex toilet paper. So we've got filthy conditions at Gallipoli. We've got no water for cleaning, no water to even wash our hands, and we have got dead bodies everywhere. We live on a farm here. We've got neighbours on either side with sheep. We have horses ourselves, we have sheep on this property, and the neighbours behind us have cattle. What does that equate to? That equates to a lot of poo, and that equates to a lot of flies. As you're watching this, you see the flies on my face, and Cody swishes his tail at flies. You got flies. You don't know the meaning of flies. They were so thick in Gallipoli that the guys were not just simply driven mad by the flies, but they couldn't eat, because every time they tried to eat, they described that whatever they were eating was instantly blackened by flies. They tried to get inside their shirts to eat, and yet they were constantly in it. They couldn't help it, constantly eating flies that had been on thousands of rotting carcasses. That's why the incident of illness and disease at Gallipoli was so horrendous. More troops were evacuated from Gallipoli while the campaign was running through illness than they were through injuries. As if all this wasn't bad enough, no water, flies, constant noise, constant fear of being killed. As if that wasn't bad enough, no fruit, no vegetables. Basically, they survived on 3 things. They talk about 3 food groups. They survived on cans of corned beef. You imagine if you went to the shops and you bought 10 cans of corned beef, you went home to your kids, grandkids, you said, guess what guys, for the next week, for tea, lunch, every day, day after day, this is all you're going to have, this can of corned beef. You'd still be eating it in a decent house, still be coming out of a fridge. Those blokes had nothing but hardtack. We've described the biscuits, the hardtack biscuits in another video. They had biscuits that could basically flour, salt, rock hard, had to be smashed with your rifle butt. You mixed it with the corned beef and water. They had that day after day after day. 260 days Gallipoli raged. They had corned beef, hardtack and jam. The jam, you think of one of our wonderful Australian products full of strawberries or apricots. As you go to spread the jam, there's real fruit in it. The tin tells you, the can will tell you the percentage of real fruit. Well, they got shit jam at Gallipoli that most often could be poured like water. And when they did, boom, it was black with flies again. And they had that for 260 days. Dysentery, I've said already. Dysentery, off the scale. Injury, illness, off the scale. That was how horrendous it was at Gallipoli. At least when they got off of Gallipoli, they're fighting in the Middle East, there was a chance to get some fruit and vegetables now and again. They got dates now and again. A treat was onions. At least the onions could be fried up to put the corned beef in with it. But the statistics, I'll just finish off the Gallipoli part with the statistics, which is when Gallipoli finished, I said it was 260 days. So when Gallipoli was all over, yes, it's horrible that Turks died there, Germans died there, French, English, Scot, Irish. Lots of people died at Gallipoli. Let's just talk, New Zealanders, sorry. Let's just talk about Australians. And so in 260 days, 5,482 Australian soldiers were killed. An additional 2,012 later died from wounds that they'd been evacuated from. So we're looking at 7,500 died. And I told you that the numbers evacuated were greater for disease than they were for injuries. Fortunately, if you're sick, you got off that hell and you got to a hospital, you had a good chance of surviving. Nonetheless, 665 Australian soldiers died of disease once they were evacuated from Gallipoli. What a hellhole. So, I touched before on trench foot, and I often used to say to Helen that when we went to an Anzac Day parade, I often used to say to Helen when we went to a dawn service for Anzac Day, people shouldn't be standing watching that dawn service normally. They should be made to stand in a foot-deep quagmire of wet mud for that service. Then they'd have some inkling of what it must have been like for those guys to be in trenches in which if you took a wrong step off a duckboard, you might actually disappear into the mud. The trenches were in winter, freezing cold, soaking wet, muddy, to the extent that there was trench foot. They had to have regular inspections so that soldiers couldn't fib. They had their feet inspected by a senior officer, a more senior officer or an NCO, to make sure they were looking after their feet. They were told to wash, however they could do that, wash and change their socks and wear clean socks on a regular basis. And it was actually a court-martial offence to allow your feet to deteriorate. You say, oh, hang on, there's a bit of a myth there. How could it be a court-martial offence up before the court-martial panel who got dirty feet? Well, that wasn't what it was. It was if they hadn't made it a serious offence, then blokes who were terrified, shell-shocked, would deliberately take their boots off, make sure their feet got some sort of infection or frostbite or something, just to get the hell out of there. And that was why it had to be a court-martial offence, just like if you put a bullet through your hand or shot a finger off. So I'm just going to finish off with two little anecdotal aspects, I guess, if you like. How bad were lice? England, New Zealand and Australia, all during the First World War, had companies that tried to come up with a powder, a bit like a talcum powder, that could be sent to the troops for them to rub on themselves in their clothes to kill the lice. Differing accounts of how effective that was. And the last thing I'll leave you with is about the blokes washing and washing their clothes. Can you imagine how desperate you are to get rid of the lice and to try and get clean if the only beach you can swim in is able to be shot at by Turkish snipers? And yet the blokes didn't hesitate. Whenever they got a chance, they stripped off, they went into the sea, and they, if you can use the word frolic, they washed themselves and got wet and soaked themselves in their hair and their clothes. There are accounts in Australian War Memorial from diaries where guys said they dived deep and then rubbed the sand all over their bodies to try and get rid of the lice, and they rubbed the seawater sand into their clothing and the seams of their clothing to try and get rid of the lice. They did that under fire. That's how bad it was. Well, there you go. That's a fairly long video about lice and trench foot, trench fever, and a good old Gallipoli Gallop. Light horse blokes may have been at Gallipoli without their horses, but there was still the Gallipoli Gallop. And that was when you had the screaming trots and you just had to run to get away from your camp because you had diarrhea. Righto, thank you to the subscriber that asked for this video. Cheers. Subscribe. Appreciate it.